Somewhere in the grand tapestry of history, we've been told that God must have changed the Sabbath. We accept it as a fact of faith, assuming the Fourth Commandment was rewritten or moved by a divine hand. But if you open the legal case file of the universe to find that moment, you encounter a chilling silence. There is no signature. There is no date of issuance. There is no official proclamation. Every law change in history leaves a trail of ink. Every amendment leaves a signature. So why is the most significant shift in the history of human worship unsigned? Tonight we aren't here to judge your tradition, but to examine the evidence. We are placing history on the stand to ask the question that centuries of tradition have tried to bury: if God didn't sign the decree, who did? To find the answer, we must travel back before the world was broken, to a moment when time itself was given a heartbeat. Our investigation begins at the very dawn of existence, with the architecture of the universe. Most of us view the Sabbath as a religious appointment, a church day, or a ritual slot on a human calendar. But return to the opening pages of Genesis, and an unsettling truth emerges. The Sabbath was never introduced as a religion. It was introduced as the very structure of time. Before there was a Jewish nation, a temple, or even the concept of sin, the Sabbath was already there. In the original Hebrew, the seventh day is defined by three creative acts: God ceased, God blessed, and God sanctified. These aren't ceremonial instructions, they are the shaping of reality. When the text says God sanctified this day, it means he engineered a specific frequency into the fabric of the universe. The Sabbath isn't just a day, it is a category of time infused with the holy. To understand this, we must grasp the mystery of menuha, often translated simply as rest. Menuha actually signifies active, completed harmony. Think of a masterpiece painting. The final brushstroke isn't doing nothing, it is the moment the work becomes whole. Ancient sages described creation as a ring missing its diamond. The universe was functional, but unfinished. Menuha was the jewel. God did not rest because he was tired. He rested because rest was the final act of creation. If you remove the seventh day, you aren't just skipping a ritual, you are living in an unfinished universe. This reveals a profound theological boundary. Ritual laws like sacrifices are remedies for a broken world. But the Sabbath was designed for a perfect one. It predates the fall of man, meaning it isn't a Jewish add-on. It is the original operating system for the entire human race. History sharpens this contrast. In the Empire of Egypt under the whip of Pharaoh, there was no Sabbath. Slaves were measured only by productivity, and time belonged to the state. The Sabbath, then, was humanity's first declaration of independence. Once every 7 days, the people of God declared with their bodies that they were not machines owned by an empire. Look at our modern 24/7 world, the midnight emails and the souls crushed by constant acceleration. Is the Sabbath merely an ancient law, or is it the only rebellion left against a modern pharaoh called work? We often say you cannot repeal architecture, but the truth is even deeper. The Sabbath is the DNA of time. You can ignore your DNA, but your body will eventually collapse. Burnout isn't just psychological, it's theological. When we violate the rhythm embedded in creation, we aren't just breaking a law. We are breaking ourselves against it. This leads to a destabilizing question. If the Sabbath exists because time exists, what authority can delete it? If God placed his fingerprint on the seventh day at the dawn of the world, who has the right to erase it? If no clear command from the Creator ever removed this pulse of creation, then what exactly changed God's will or our assumptions? The mystery deepens at Sinai. If the Sabbath is the DNA of creation, it had to be formally anchored into the foundation of human morality. To find our answer, we must go to the mountain, where this law was engraved not with ink, but with fire and stone. It is there that history begins to bend. If the Sabbath is the DNA of creation, Sinai is where that DNA became the supreme constitution of the universe. To understand the weight of the Fourth Commandment, we must view the Decalogue not as moral advice, but as a divine legal framework. In any legal system, there is a hierarchy. Statutes change, but a constitution defines the kingdom. God did not delegate these 10 commandments to a prophet's pen or a scribe's parchment. He engraved them with his own finger onto stone. In the ancient world, you wrote on papyrus for a season, but you engraved on stone for eternity. You do not amend a divine constitution with human tradition, and you cannot override a celestial mandate with cultural habit. Look at the architecture of this law. The Sabbath is the hinge of the entire Decalogue, standing between our duty to God and our duty to man. It is the only commandment that connects the Creator to the creature through a specific point in time. More importantly, the Sabbath functions as the seal of the law. Legally, a decree is only valid if it bears the king's seal containing his name, his title, and his jurisdiction. The Fourth Commandment is the only one that identifies the lawgiver as the Lord, his title as Creator, and his territory as heaven and earth. Without the Sabbath, the law is anonymous. It loses its signature and its authority. This creates a devastating logical crisis in modern theology. We often treat 9 of the commandments as eternal moral and non-negotiable, while treating the fourth as an optional footnote. We would never argue that "thou shalt not kill" was merely for ancient Israel, or that "thou shalt not steal" was a ceremonial shadow that passed away. By what authority do we treat the only commandment that begins with the word "remember" as the only one the world is permitted to forget? If the moral law reflects God's immutable character, it cannot be edited to fit the convenience of an empire or the traditions of men. If you remove the hinge, the door falls. When we treat the Sabbath as a suggestion rather than a constitutional mandate, we aren't just moving a day. We are challenging the sovereignty of the legislator himself. But the mystery deepens. Many claim the constitutional shift happened because of the lawgiver himself. They say Jesus of Nazareth came to abolish the very law he wrote in stone. To find the truth, we must follow his footsteps from the fire of Sinai to the dust of Galilee. Did the king come to end the Sabbath, or was he doing something far more radical to save it? When we move from the fire of Sinai to the dust of Galilee, we encounter the primary argument used to justify a change in the Sabbath, the life of Jesus himself. Traditional theology often points to the fierce confrontations between Jesus and the religious elite as evidence that he was dismantling the Fourth Commandment. But a closer investigation reveals that Jesus wasn't breaking the Sabbath, he was reclaiming it. To understand the conflict, we have to understand the clutter. By the 1st century, religious leaders had buried the Sabbath under thousands of microscopic, man-made rules, legalistic fences that turned a day of liberation into a spiritual prison. When Jesus stepped onto the scene, he didn't touch the Sabbath to destroy it. He touched it to clean it. Think of it this way. Imagine you own a magnificent historic estate, but you find it occupied by squatters who have boarded up the windows and filled the halls with trash. When you start tearing down the boards and throwing out the rubbish, are you destroying the house? Of course not. You are restoring it. When the owner cleans his house, it doesn't mean he's moving out. It means he intends to stay. Every time Jesus healed a withered hand or defended his disciples in the grain fields, he wasn't attacking the commandment, he was attacking the abuse of the commandment. He was removing the tradition-bound trash to reveal the original architecture of mercy. If a divine gift is turned into a weapon of control, God does not remain silent, he intervenes. Jesus made a staggering claim. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath. To the modern ear, we hear this as a license to ignore the day. But to a first-century mind, the title, Lord of the Sabbath, was a claim of absolute ownership. You don't claim lordship over something you are about to abolish. By calling himself the Lord of the day, Jesus was signing his name to it, declaring that the seventh day belongs to him. He wasn't changing the calendar. He was changing the heart. Look at his miracles. Why did Jesus choose the Sabbath for his most controversial healings? Because the seventh day is the perfect time for restoration. If the Sabbath is a celebration of a perfect creation, there is no better day for the Creator to restore a broken body. In his hands, the Sabbath wasn't violated by liberation, it was fulfilled by it. Jesus lived as the ultimate Sabbath keeper, proving the day was a sanctuary for the soul, not a burden for the back. But if the Lord of the house reclaimed the Sabbath and never moved out, how did the house eventually end up with a different address? If Jesus didn't change the day, we must look to those who followed him. To find the moment the Sabbath truly began to fade, we have to examine a silent transition where a single linguistic misunderstanding would change the course of history. To find the moment the Sabbath began to fade, we must leave the mountains of Israel and enter the Roman palace. Here the focus is no longer revelation from heaven, but the cold strategy of imperial unity. The shift wasn't born in a prayer meeting, it was forged in a political office. In 321 AD, Emperor Constantine issued a decree that changed history. He didn't cite a gospel verse, he issued a secular mandate requiring rest on the venerabilis dies solis, the venerable day of the sun. This was a masterstroke of political bilingualism. To the pagans, it honored the sun god Sol Invictus. To the Christians, it seemed to honor the resurrection. It was one decree, two symbols, and one goal: total social synchronization. While some Christians already gathered on the first day, Constantine's edict did what the church could not. It turned a religious habit into a mandatory social rhythm. The empire used civil law to override the Fourth Commandment. Over time, church councils like Laodicea criminalized Sabbath-keeping, labeling it Judaizing. A powerful psychological shift occurred when the state backs a tradition. It gains an aura of morality. Eventually, what everyone does is mistaken for what God commanded. The conclusion is haunting. The shift did not come from a new revelation from the throne of God. It came from an empire trying to manage the followers of God. It was a strategic compromise that traded the seal of the Creator for the stability of Rome. If the change was orchestrated by politics rather than Scripture, where does that leave us? In a world that demands your soul as a sacrifice to productivity, is returning to the Sabbath a legalistic burden, or is it the ultimate liberation from the modern pharaohs of our age? The final question isn't about history, it's about the courage to reclaim what was stolen. We have traced the ink of empires and the silence of the scriptures, uncovering a trail that leads not to a divine throne, but to a Roman palace. But at the end of this investigation, we realize that the Sabbath was never meant to be a religious burden or a legalistic trap. It was designed as a sanctuary in time, a holy act of resistance against a world that demands your soul as a sacrifice to productivity. Today we live under a modern pharaoh that never sleeps, measured by our output and exhausted by the constant acceleration of a 24/7 society. In this context, the Sabbath is more than just a day. It is a declaration of independence. It is a rebellion against slavery to time, to systems, and to empires. It is the moment you reclaim your identity as a human being made in the image of God, rather than a machine owned by the state or the economy. This is the history. This is the evidence. But beyond the facts of the past, we want to know where you stand. Does the specific day still matter to the Creator, or has the rhythm of the heart replaced the rhythm of the clock? We value your perspective, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. We read every insight as we continue this journey of discovery together. If you value uncovering the truths that history has tried to hide, we invite you to subscribe and join our community of seekers. Next time the sun sets on a Friday evening, and the world demands one more hour of your life, ask yourself a single haunting question. Am I listening to the voice of the shepherd or the echo of an emperor